I am Ryan McKnight, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 52 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, May 18th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Last historical episode, we covered what happened to Joe, Hyrum, Rigdon, Caleb Baldwin, Alexander McCrae, and Lyman White once they were incarcerated in the Liberty Jail in Clay County, Missouri. The situation was bleak for all. Joe and Hyrum, brothers behind bars, were concerned with what was happening to the Saints as they were being removed from Missouri during that harsh winter of 1838 to 39. And of course, Rigdon was oscillating between states of manic complaint about the situation and being nearly nonverbal in the throes of depressive episodes. His mind was on the breaking point, and he was dragging everybody else in the jail ever closer to insanity along with him. Finally, Joe and friends appeared in front of a judge on a plea of habeas corpus, with Alexander Donovan representing everybody but Hingepin Rigdon, who decided to represent himself pro se. Then, because everything turns on this guy, when Rigdon, representing only himself, addressed the court from a reclined cot in his sickly state, he turned everybody's hearts into mashed potatoes and they all cried for his release. Rigdon then subsequently organized an elaborate escape attempt with the prison guards in case any Missourian vigilantes planned to take care of him upon his lawful release. So the night of the escape, Rigdon feigned a scuffle with one of the guards, and then he booked it down the road, leaving his wife and son-in-law behind, only to pull out a gun and point it at his son-in-law when they caught up. Rigdon was obviously in a fragile mental state, but after that, he, according to Richard Van Wagner, spared no horseflesh in getting back to Illinois on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River over the next few days, and he did so through backwoods roads to elude any possible vigilantes he may have encountered. Realistically, the vitriol the Missourians held for the Mormons was still a force to be reckoned with. The Mormon leaders were in constant danger of a lynching, which likely would have been swept under the rug in the wake of the Jacksonian bully majority democracy, which had only been manufactured over the previous 9 years and further embraced by Martin Van Buren. So let's talk on that for a minute, okay? Obviously, the Missourians got what they wanted by the time Rigdon was making his way to Illinois. All along, the Missourians just wanted the Mormons out of their counties, and preferably out of their state, and they had the quasi-legal surrender terms enforced by General John B. Clark, which forced the Mormons to leave. By early February of 39, the majority of the Saints were either in Illinois or were in the process of getting to Illinois through Missouri. Very few Mormons remained in Missouri in Caldwell or Clay counties by the end of winter in 39. But the sentiments and public outrage that led to the Mormons being removed in the first place still burned fervently in the minds of the anti-Mormon Missourians. I mean, they had escaped without losing any major leaders and without any major loss in life. And that made many of these Missourians, well, essentially happy with the situation. You know, it would take a few years, but eventually people began to realize that the Mormons had been totally screwed over legally and had no allies. but no recourse would be attained for anything that happened to the Mormons in Missouri. And let's face it, Joe and friends never really paid for what they did. They were never in a subsequent civil court after this court of inquiry to determine legal prosecution. They spent a few months in Liberty Jail, and then they escaped. That's it. The Mormons were never repaid for what the militia inflicted upon them, but they also never paid for what they inflicted upon the state, which included assaulting a state-sanctioned militia with deadly force, among many other illegal activities. The Mormon leadership was deserving of a harsh sentence for anybody responsible for the Mormon actions in Missouri from August to October of 1838, but nobody paid for it. The whole situation was largely ignored and swept under the rug because nobody was in the right. But those are details that we're going to be discussing kind of in this episode. So let's get into the meat now that we've consumed our fill of the milk from last week's episode. So for the meat today, let's set the scene. Rigdon had very recently settled in the makeshift halfway camp of Quincy, Illinois, and was the presiding church leader while Joe and Hyrum and the other members continued to languish in Liberty Jail. The last historical episode, we focused on Rigdon quite a bit, and this episode will be focused more on Joe and Hyrum Smith along with their 3 friends locked up in Liberty Jail. We'll still be talking a little bit about what Rigdon was doing on the outside to kind of provide historical context, but our main focus today is on Joe's experience in the jail. We're going to try and put our minds there. We're going to see what it was like for Joe without Snapchat or Twitter or anything to get updates that he could rely on. He was just learning what was going on with the Mormons through hearsay of visitors and letter exchanges. So let's try and put our minds there. Not knowing what was going on outside of the Liberty Jail, only being able to associate with people who actively come and visit or send letters. It was dark and very cold inside Liberty Jail. The dungeon had essentially driven Rigdon mad to the point that he was released, but that still left Joe stuck in the dungeon with 4 other people, languishing, wondering, hoping that things would change soon. The men are struggling to cleave to their sanity, and the jail only seems to get smaller, closing in on their waning sense of reality while being completely disconnected from the outside world. The jailers do their job, but they can't stop people from coming up to the window and yelling at the prophet, "Where's your gold Bible now? And when it come time to release you fellers, we'll see if we can't get a little justice from that tree branch over there." I mean, their voices are just echoing through the darkened stone room with nothing but matted down straw and the prisoners' fearful minds to absorb their blasphemy and death threats. Out there on the other side of these walls, there's so much to do, so many people to converse with and items of business to attend. In here, there's just terrible food, crushing boredom, and idle time for deep self-reflection. This was the longest Joe had ever spent in jail before. He'd had a few run-ins with the law prior to this point, but none of those resulted in any jail time more than just a few days. Now, at one point, Joseph Sr., that's Big Daddy Cheese as we know him, spent a month in jail back in 1830, but that was debtor's prison for a $14 debt that he owed to some wealthy guy in New York. But his month in jail was nothing like what his son was currently going through in Liberty. The worst part of it all, nobody knows how long they'd be here. They had made their appearance in front of the judge and Rigdon got off, but Donovan couldn't do diddly squat for Joe and friends to get them released. They hadn't even had a real trial and sentencing yet. They were just being held as the state prepared its case against the Mormons, or more realistically, waited for the Mormons to leave so that they just didn't have to deal with it. There was no telling if Joe and his friends would be there for another month or another 10 years. And fear of the unknown must have been utterly soul-shattering. And it's probably a good thing that Rigdon got away, though. You know, Joe was sick of hearing his constant bitching. All of the men were going through the same physical turmoil as Rigdon, they just didn't complain as much as he did. but Rigdon was a good guy. You know, he's helped Joe since they teamed up in early 1831. He knew how to run a church, and he took Joe under his wing. You know, Joe has been a smart and worthy apprentice, even if his sense of adventure had occasionally gotten them into these little small bouts of trouble. But, you know, if not for Rigdon, Zion would never have been declared as Independence, Missouri. If not for him, none of this business with the Mormons in Missouri would have happened. And, well, yeah, when we kind of consider that, is that actually a good thing or a bad thing? You know, without Rigdon, the Missouri Mormon War in 1838 never would have happened. It's kind of interesting to think about. But, good thing for everybody, the trusted Bloody Brigham Young is in Illinois saying stuff like this, taken from page 230 of Volume 3 of the History of the Church, a source and text critical edition edited by Dan Vogel. Quote, "About this time, President Brigham Young proposed to Bishop Partridge to help the poor out of the state of Missouri. The bishop replied, 'The poor may take care of themselves, and I will take care of myself.' President Young replied, quote, 'If you will not help them out, I will.'" End quote. Bloody Brigham was actually a good guy, and Joe knew that he could trust Bloody Brigham. But was Rigdon still trustworthy? I mean, he did just feign an escape and leave his wife and son-in-law behind as he sprinted from the jailhouse. Maybe he can be trusted, but can he be predicted? You know, obviously, Rigdon was going to look out for the saints, but what would he do without Joe there to keep him in check? If Rigdon does start to make a power grab, what happens then? Would Bloody Brigham and the quorum follow him because he's the church leader that's not in jail? Fear of the unknown must have been strangling the prophet's synapses at this point. And a mere half month after incarceration, Joe sent a letter to the church in Caldwell County. This is dated December 16th, 1838. It basically tells the church that everything's going to be fine, keep believing in us, we're just being persecuted like Big J was in J-Town. Here are a couple of excerpts taken from that letter on the josephsmithpapers.org. Now, before reading that, I'll let you know right now, the vast majority of the letters that I'm reading today are all taken from the Joseph Smith Papers, and they're all covering late 1838 and early 1839. And there are links to all of these letters in the show notes. So if you want to question or contend with anything that I'm saying, or think that I might be taking something out of context, please go back and read the letters for yourself. They are all widely available in their original handwritten form, as well as transcribed into a PDF format. So, this is the letter dated 16th of December, 1838 from Joseph Smith. Quote, "To the Church of Latter-day Saints in Caldwell County, and the saints scattered abroad, and are persecuted and made desolate, and are afflicted in divers manners for Christ's sake, and the gospel's, and whose perils are greatly augmented by the wickedness and corruption of false brethren. May grace, mercy, and peace be and abide with you, and notwithstanding all your sufferings, we assure you that you have our prayers and fervent desires for your welfare both day and night. Know assuredly, dear brethren, that it is for the testimony of Jesus that we are in bonds and in prison." Continuing later on, "Those who have sought by their unbelief and wickedness and by the principle of mobocracy to destroy us and the people of God by killing and scattering them abroad and willfully and maliciously delivering us into the hands of murderers, desiring us to be put to death, thereby having us dragged about in chains and cast into prison. And for what cause? It is because we were honest men and were determined to defend the lives of the saints at the expense of our own. We glory in our tribulation because we know that God is with us, that he is our friend, and that he will save our souls. We do not care for those that kill the body. They cannot harm our souls. We ask no favors at the hands of the mobs, nor of the world, nor of the devil, nor of his emissaries, the dissenters." End quote. Now, that's essentially the tone of this letter that they sent. This is at the beginning of their stay in Liberty Jail. I mean, they were confined there at the very beginning of December. This was half a month into their confinement. And, whoever wrote this, it was obviously dictated from Joseph and Rigdon, but whoever wrote it down took a second, or whoever dictated it, I guess I should say, took a minute to disparage some of those people who testified against the leadership in the Court of Inquiry in November. That was just a month prior to when this letter was penned. Quote, "Look at the dissenters. And again, if you were of the world would love its own. Look at Mr. George Hinkle, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Look at his brother John Correll. Look at the beloved brother Reed Peck, who aided him in leading us as the Savior was led into the camp as a lamb prepared for the slaughter, and a sheep dumb before his shearer. So we opened not our mouth. But these brethren, like Balaam, being greedy for a reward, sold us into the hands of those who loved them, for the world loves his own." End quote. And then, after that, the letter goes on to screed about how the incarcerated individuals were completely innocent, because they're the ones writing the letter, and the fact that they are only in there because George Hinkle and John Correll and Thomas Marsh and all of these people sold them out for their own immunity. And then it goes on to talk about the mobocrats who were warring against the saints in Missouri in the first place. Here's another quote from it. Quote, "Hence, mobbers were encouraged by priests and Levites, by the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, and the Herodians, and the most ruthless, abandoned, and debauched, lawless, inhuman, and most beastly set of men that the earth can boast of. And indeed, a parallel cannot be found anywhere else. To gather together, to seal, to plunder, to starve, and to exterminate and burn the houses of the Mormons. These are the characters that by their treasonable and avert acts have desolated and laid waste Daviess County. These are the characters that would fain make all the world believe that we are guilty of the above-named acts. But they represent us falsely. We say unto you that we have not committed treason, nor any other unlawful act in Daviess County. Was it for murder in Ray County against mob militia, who was a wolf in the first instant, hide and hair, teeth and legs and tail, who afterwards put on a militia sheepskin with the wool on, who can sally forth in the daytime into the flock and snarl and show his teeth, and scatter and devour the flock and satiate himself upon his prey, and then sneak back into the brambles in order that he might conceal himself in his well-tried skin with the wool on." End quote. I mean, it's incredible. It's effectively demonizing any of the quote-unquote mobocrats who masqueraded as a wolf in sheep's clothing as a state-sanctioned militia and led to, well, whatever happened, whatever was happening in Liberty Jail. So, I mean, it's... Let me just read another excerpt here. The letter essentially ends with a bunch of, like, preacher dribble, but they're trying to exhort the church members to be faithful, even though they were actively being driven out of Missouri at that very moment. And after reading the entire letter, there are no explicit instructions to the saints, with the exception of telling them to remain in Far West for a time, and then calling out a few Mormons specifically for betraying the leadership. And there's one really good passage, and it's about D-Day David Whitmer. You know, a guy who's been there since the very, very beginning. A person whose house Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon in. I mean, it's incredible to think that this is how they're painting David Whitmer. Quote, "This poor man, who professes to be much of a prophet, has no other dumb ass to ride but David Whitmer, to forbid his madness when he goes up to curse Israel. And this ass not being of the same kind of Balaam's, therefore the angel, notwithstanding, appeared unto him, yet he could not penetrate his understanding sufficiently. So, but what he brays out cursings instead of blessings. Poor ass, whoever lives to see it, will see him and his rider perish, like those who perished in the gainsaying of Korah, or after the same condemnation." End quote. I mean, this is like this Bible speech and this kind of esoteric language and the way that they are painting David Whitmer. Essentially, they are saying that he is the dumb ass, like Balaam's ass, but David Whitmer didn't tell them that there's, danger that lays ahead as Balaam's ass did. So essentially, whoever was penning this letter, or dictating this letter, I should say, was calling David Whitmer dumber than Balaam's ass in the Bible. I mean, how the tables have turned, right? The Whitmers used to be trusted leaders, scribes, and historians for the church, and now David Whitmer, one of the 3 witnesses, is called a dumb ass who wouldn't open his mouth in the face of danger, the way that Balaam's ass did. I mean, it's incredible. Now, granted, there were saints coming and going, frequently visiting the prophet and his acolytes in their dungeon. We don't have any way of tracking all of the people that came and went, but rest assured, the prophet and his friends weren't perfectly lonely during this time. We can, however, begin to understand the little singularities of order amidst this vast battlefield of chaotic forces acting upon each other. Heber C. Kimball and Bloody Brigham were given charge of the saints in the absence of Joe Hyrum and Rigdon. This is the correspondence emerging from Liberty Jail 9 days before the habeas corpus hearing where Rigdon was released. Quote, "It is not wisdom for you to go out of Caldwell with your families yet for a little season until we are out of prison, after which time you may act your pleasure. But though you take your families out of the state, yet it will be necessary for you to return and leave as before designed on the 26th of April. Inasmuch as we are in prison, and for a little season, if need be, the management of the affairs of the church devolves on you. That is, the 12, the gathering. Let the churches in England continue there, till further orders, till a door can be opened for them. Except they choose to come to America and take their chance with the saints here. If they do that, let them come. And if they choose to come, they would do well to send wise men before them and buy out Kirtland and the regions round about. Or they may settle where they can till things may alter." And it continues further down. "We nominate George A. Smith and Lyman Sherman to take the place of Orson Hyde and Thomas B. Marsh. Brethren, fear not, but be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might." End quote. So the letter had a few more directives in it, but it was still really hard to know what was happening to the saints at the hands of the still, zealous mobocrats who were constantly giving them trouble. The idea of moving to Illinois was still not quite in the minds of the Mormons. They knew they had to get out of Missouri, and the only options they had were Illinois, Iowa, elsewhere in Missouri, which seemed fairly unlikely because they'd kind of overstayed their welcome in Missouri already, or they could trace their steps back to Indiana or Ohio and try and settle there. But they'd been chased from Kirtland by the church there. Joe and friends wanted to go back to Kirtland, so they held it as a possibility while imprisoned, specifying to Bloody Brigham and Heber C. Kimball that saints can come over from England if they just send money to buy plots in Kirtland first. But the church had no allies remaining in Kirtland. They couldn't stay in Missouri, and novel solutions were needed to be considered. Joe still didn't understand what was happening in the winterscape that lie beyond the walls of Liberty Jail. So the next letter to be dictated in the echoing chamber of sickness and bodily smells was to the Missouri State Legislature, detailing the problems that the Mormons had with the trial. That was a court of inquiry. This was essentially the letter which got them into the habeas corpus hearing where Rigdon preached to his release. But they do bring up some important points concerning Judge Austin A. King, who had been the presiding judge over the court of inquiry back in November, 2 months prior to when this letter was sent. Quote, "It is not our object to complain, to asperse anyone. All we ask is a fair and impartial trial. We ask the sympathies of no one. We ask sheer justice. 'Tis all we expect and all we merit, but we merit that." It continues further on down in the letter. But it is a difficult task to change opinions once formed. The other obstacle which we candidly consider are of the most weighty is the feeling which we believe is entertained by the Honorable Austin A. King against us, and his consequent incapacity to do us impartial justice. It is from no disposition to speak disrespectfully of that high officer that we lay before your honorable body the facts we do, but simply that the legislature may be apprised of our real condition. We look upon Judge King as like all other mere men, liable to be influenced by his feelings, his prejudices, and his previously formed opinions. Now that's reasonable, right? They're saying Judge King is a human being. He may be an honorable justice, but he's still a human being subject to all of his feelings and influences and prejudices. So the conclusion that they draw later on in the letter says, "He has written much upon the subject of our late difficulties, in which he has placed us in the wrong. These letters have been published to the world. He has also presided at an excited public meeting as chairman, and no doubt sanctioned all the proceedings. We believe that the foundation of the feeling against us, which we have reason to think Judge King entertains, may be traced to the unfortunate troubles which occurred in Jackson County some few years ago. In a battle between the Mormons and a portion of the citizens of that county, Mr. Brassel, who is Hugh Brazel, the brother-in-law of Judge King, was killed. It is natural that the king should have some feelings against us, whether we were right or wrong in that controversy." End quote. They make some relevant points, and by extension, relevant complaints. There really wasn't any question about Judge King's partiality considering the Mormons. He hated them. Simple as that. He should have recused himself for the court of inquiry. The incarcerated leaders knew this to be an injustice in violation of a fair and speedy trial, which hadn't actually happened yet because the court of inquiry wasn't an actual trial, but they wanted to be heard again in a court in a different circuit where Judge King wasn't presiding or even present. They really hated Judge King just as much as he hated the Mormons, which goes way back to the hearing that they'd had on Raglan's farm, and that was back in like August or something to that effect. The prisoners were finally fed up. After the hearing, after this letter happened, they had the habeas corpus hearing. Rigdon had been released in that little bullshit escape attempt thing or whatever happened there. And then the remaining 5 prisoners had dealt with enough terrible food and abysmal living circumstances. With the mysteries of what was happening on a day-to-day basis outside of the jail constantly bearing down on Joe and Hyrum, they needed to regain control as the Mormons were amidst their mass exodus towards Quincy, Illinois. They had been told, not in any writing correspondence but by word of mouth, that Illinois seemed to be friendly to the refugee saints, and that the Quorum of the 12 had been organizing parties to make the journey to Quincy, Illinois. But all of the details were too vague to really know what was going on. They were in the fog of war, essentially. Finally, Joe and the other 4 Mormons in Liberty Jail attempted an escape. Unsuccessfully. And no writings actually exist during February of 1839. Likely because the Mormons were simply too busy organizing and moving during that month to take the time to sit down and write to the prophet and his friends. The escape attempt around February 6th was thwarted by vigilant prison guards. However, their second escape attempt happened in early to mid-March. And this is from the history.lds.org article about Liberty Jail concerning their escape attempt and Caleb Baldwin's reaction to the prison guards, doing their job. They were just doing their job and Baldwin was pissed off. And there's a link for this article in the show notes. I recommend reading it. Quote, 2 days later, on March 17th, Samuel Tillery, one of the jailers, inspected the lower level dungeon and found an auger handle, which he believed was being used by the prisoners to chisel their way through the thick walls. Tillery ordered 25 men downstairs to finish the search, then ordered his contingent to chain Joseph Smith and the prisoners to the floor. Having already bottled up 3.5 months of stress, anguish, and frustration, Baldwin furiously rose to his feet, looked the jailer in the eye, and affirmed, "Tillery, if you put those chains on me, I will kill you. So help me God." In the words of Hyrum Smith, Tillery soon calmed down and agreed to call again and settle the matter. While Baldwin's fiery threat temporarily settled the dispute, the prisoners were put under even heavier guard. Just 3 days after the scuffle with Samuel Tillery, Baldwin was still on edge and wondered if he would ever see or hear from his family again. End quote. And realistically, everybody was on edge, right? They wanted out, but the jail was built too well for them to realistically effect an escape. Now, that auger was used to make a hole in the wall, but since there were loose pack rocks in between the inner railroad tie boards, the inner wall of the jail, and the outer wall brick structure, there were these loose pack rocks, so the hole that they made to try and widen the window just enough to squeeze out of, it filled in with more rocks. Rocks just fell down anywhere that they tried to dig through. The second escape attempt was obviously foiled, but Joe was happy that he had cost the state, quote, a round sum of money, end quote, when he damaged the jail in trying to dig out. But while this whole thing served as some little consolation to Joe and everybody's sufferings, he and the 4 others were still stuck in jail with no possibility of escape for quite some time afterwards. They continued to share correspondence with church leaders throughout March, but not a single word was written between Joe and Rigdon during this entire incarceration. It was afterwards, but not during. Joe, however, was in regular contact with Bishop Edward Partyboy Partridge. We haven't heard much from him. But during this incarceration, Edward Partyboy Partridge and Joe were talking back and forth. But Joe wasn't actually there himself to meet with people and make personal assessments of their character. You know, Partyboy Partridge was keeping Joe up to date on relevant dealings, but he was only acting in absentia of the leadership. Next I'm going to read a couple of small excerpts from a letter that was written by Partyboy Partridge on March 5th, 1839, from Quincy, Illinois, to those still incarcerated in Liberty Jail. I'm going to read kind of the majority of it. It's really not that long, because it cues us in on a few things that were going on in Illinois with only Rigdon to be a representative for the church leadership. Now remember, these letter exchanges and occasional visits were the only way by which the Mormon leadership could know of what was going on outside their confinement. We're able to look on this with historical hindsight, but the people in that jail only knew what other people were telling them. And Partyboy Partridge was one of those few connections. This is the majority of his letter. I've only removed a couple of meaningless excerpts. Quote, "Beloved brethren, having an opportunity to send directly to you by Brother David Rogers, I feel to write a few lines to you. President Rigdon, Judge Higbee, that's Elias Higbee, Israel Barlow, and myself went to see Dr. Isaac Galland week before last." Keep that name in mind, Isaac Galland. "Brother Rigdon, Higbee, and myself are of opinion that it is not wisdom to make a trade with the doctor at present," that's Dr. Galland. "Possibly it may be wisdom to effect a trade hereafter. The people received us kindly here. They have contributed near $100 cash besides other property for the relief of the suffering among our people. Brother Joseph's wife lives at Judge Cleveland's," that's John Cleveland's. "I have not seen her, but I sent her word of this opportunity to send to you. Brother Hyrum," that's Hyrum Smith's wife, "lives not far from me. I have been to see her a number of times. Her health was very poor when she arrived, but she has been getting better. She knows of this opportunity to send. I saw Sister White," that's Harriet Benton White, "soon after her arrival here. All were well. I understood that she had moved out about 2 miles with Father Isaac Higbee and John Higbee, who are finishing this spring." So, I know this, like, I'm just saying a bunch of names of people that are living with other people. the reason I'm reading this is so you can understand from their perspective, from the Joe and Hyrum's perspective, what it was like to hear what their families were doing. They had no way of knowing how their families were making the trip from Missouri to Illinois, what was happening with them, if any of them had died from sickness. They simply had no idea. So, of course, Party Boy Partridge was nice enough to tell all of the men that were incarcerated about their families and what was going on with them. So this is how they learned what was going on with their families. It really would have sucked, to be honest. I'll continue reading here. Sister Eunice Fitzgerald McCrae, that is Alexander McCrae's wife, is here living with Brother Henderson and is well. I believe she knows of this opportunity to send. Brother Caleb Baldwin's family I have not seen and do not know that she has got here as yet. She may, however, be upon the other side of the river. The ice has run these 3 days past so that there has been no crossing. The weather is now moderating and the crossing will soon commence again. The place is full of our people, that's Quincy, Illinois, yet they are scattering off nearly all the while. I expect to start tomorrow for Pittsfield Pike County, Illinois, about 45 miles southeast from this place. Brother George W. Robinson, that's Rigdon's son-in-law, told me this morning that he expected that his father-in-law, Judge Higbee, and himself would go on a farm about 20 miles northeast from this place. Some of the leading men have given us, that is our people, an invitation to settle in and about this place. Many, no doubt, will stay here. Brethren, I hope that you will bear patiently the privations that you are called to endure. The Lord will deliver in his own due time. Your letter respecting the trade with Gallon was not received here until after our return from his residence at the head of the shoal or rapids. If Brother Rigdon were not here, we might, after receiving your letter, come to a different conclusion respecting that trade. And that's the land trade with Isaac Gallant. Keep that in mind. It's important when we're going to discuss it here. There are some here that are sanguine that we ought to trade with the doctor. Bishop Newell K. Whitney and Vincent Knight are not here and have not been here as I know of. Brother Isaac Morley and Titus Billings have settled some 20 or 25 miles north of this place for the present. A Brother Lee, who lived near Hans Mill, died on the opposite side of the river a few days since. Brother Rigdon preached his funeral sermon in the courthouse. It is a general time of health here. We greatly desire to see you and to have you enjoy your freedom. The citizens here are willing that we should enjoy the privileges guaranteed to all civil people without molestation. I remain your brother in the Lord, signed Edward Partridge, to Joseph Smith Jr. and others confined in Liberty Jail, Missouri. End quote. That letter told Joe and the other people in the jail very crucial information concerning what the church leadership and specifically Rigdon were all doing while these prisoners continue to languish in that smoke-filled hellhole. And also told them about their families, because obviously these men were worried about what was going on with their families. So it was really nice of Party Boy Partridge to send this letter to tell them that all is okay, essentially. But what is important is something that we're going to pick up soon. The opening paragraph told of a bunch of church leaders gathering to meet with this guy, Dr. Isaac Gallant. Now, we know what happens with this guy and what's going on outside the jail. But remember, we're looking at this with historical hindsight. We have 20/20 vision, essentially. Joe and his friends in the jail had blinders on. They couldn't see anywhere past the two little porthole windows that were, just offering a small view and very little fresh air to these men that were locked in this cage not fit for vermin. We'll pick up with Isaac Gallant a little bit later in the episode, but just keep that name in mind, Dr. Isaac Gallant. So let's continue reading a few more letters to and from Liberty Jail. We can continue to put ourselves in that darkened cell with the Mormon leadership, looking at the outside world through these letters and these various correspondences that they had. So the next written correspondence to enter the melancholy walls of the prison was a letter written to Joe and Hyrum by their younger brothers. That's Crazy William and Don Carlos Smith. This was the only real way that Joe and Hyrum figured out the details of how their families were doing beyond what Party Boy Partridge had told them. It must have been pure anguish to hear only these little snippets of information hurriedly scrawled down by people who were too busy to even care what Joe and Hyrum would direct from this jail cell. These people were going about their very hard lives with the prophet and his closest counselor absent. Why did they still need a prophet? I mean, why did they even need to take the time to write to him? I think those are unanswerable questions. But this is the essentially the entirety of the letter. I did snip out a couple of little pieces here, but this is the letter that Don Carlos and Crazy William sent to their brothers Joe and Hyrum in Liberty Jail. Quote, "Having an opportunity to send a line to you, I do not feel disposed to let it slip unnoticed. Father's family have all arrived in this state, except you two. And could I but see your faces this side of the Mississippi and know and realize that you had been delivered from your enemies, it would certainly light up a new gleam of hope in our bosoms. Nothing could be more satisfactory. Nothing could give us more joy. Emma and children are well. They live 3 miles from here and have a tolerable good place. Hyram's children and mother Grinolds are living at present with father. They are all well. Mary Fielding Smith, that's Hyram's wife, has not got her health yet, but I think it increases slowly." Continuing later on in the letter, "Father and mother," that's of course Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr., "stood their journey remarkably. They are in tolerable health. Samuel," that's Samuel Smith's wife, "has been sick ever since they arrived. William Smith has removed 40 miles from here, but is here now and says he is anxious to have you liberated and see you enjoy liberty once more. My family is well. My health has not been good for about 2 weeks, and for 2 or 3 days. The toothache has been my tormentor. It all originated from a severe cold. Dear brethren, we just heard that the governor says that he is going to set you all at liberty. I hope it's true. Other letters that you will probably receive will give you information concerning the warm feelings of the people here towards us. After writing these hurried lines in misery, I close by leaving the blessings of God with you, and praying for your health, prosperity, and restitution to liberty. This from a true friend and a brother, signed Don Carlos Smith." And then after that, William Smith dictates just like one paragraph, and he says, "Brother Hyrum and Joseph Smith, I should have called down to Liberty to have seen you, had it not been for the multiplicity of business that was on my hands. And again, I thought perhaps that the people might think that the Mormons would rise up to liberate you. Consequently, too many going to see you might make it worse for you. But we all long to see you and have you come out of that lonesome place. I hope you will be permitted to come to your families before long. Do not worry about them, for they will be taken care of. All we can do will be done. Further than this, we can only hope, wish, desire, and pray for your deliverance." Signed, William Smith. End quote. That is the letter that was sent from brothers to brothers outside of the jail to the inside of the jail. And it was penned on March 6th. The Smith family were obviously amidst a fair amount of toil and discomfort, and William, Crazy Willie as he is, did make a good point. He said that I want to come down and visit you, but A, I've been way too busy, and B, if a whole bunch of Mormons come down and visit the prophet, then the guards are going to get really suspicious, thinking that maybe the Mormons are going to try and break him out. So he made some good points. But the point is, the exodus from Missouri to Illinois was in full swing by March 1839, and the majority of Saints were settling in this tiny little township of Quincy, Illinois, forcing an area with accommodations for a few families to balloon to inhabit a few thousand Mormons as they disembarked from the ferry across the Mississippi River. The next day, Joe received a letter from his wife, Emma. And I'm going to let the letter speak for itself. But remember, visitors and letters were the only connection these men had to their families, and the only way they could tell if the families were doing well or if somebody had fallen to some great calamity or something. Quote, "Dear husband, having an opportunity to send by a friend, I make an attempt to write. But I shall not attempt to write my feelings altogether, for the situation in which you are, the walls, bars, and bolts, rolling rivers, running streams, rising hills, sinking valleys, and spreading prairies that separate us, and the cruel injustice that first cast you into prison and still holds you there, with many other considerations, places my feelings far beyond description. Was it not for conscious innocence and the direct interposition of divine mercy, I am very sure I never should have been able to have endured the scenes of suffering that I have passed through since what is called the militia came into Far West under the ever-to-be-remembered governor's notable order. An order fraught with as much wickedness as ignorance, and as much ignorance as was ever contained in an article of that length. But I still live and am yet willing to suffer more if it is the will of kind heaven that I should for your sake. Wow, Emma is really an amazing writer. We are all well at present, except Frederick, who is quite sick. Little Alexander, who is now in my arms, is one of the finest little fellows you ever saw in your life. He is strong, that with the assistance of a chair he will run all around the room. I am now living at Judge Cleveland's, 4 miles from the village of Quincy. I do not know how long I shall stay here. I want you to write an answer by the bearer. I left your change of clothes with Heber C. Kimball when I came away, and he agreed to see that you had clean clothes as often as necessary. No one but God knows the reflections of my mind and the feelings of my heart when I left our house and home, and almost all of everything that we possessed excepting our little children, and took journey out of the state of Missouri, leaving you shut up in that lonesome prison. But the recollection is more than the human nature ought to bear. And if God does not record our sufferings and avenge our wrongs on them that are guilty, I shall be sadly mistaken. The daily sufferings of our brethren in traveling and camping out nights, and those on the other side of the river, would beggar the most lively description. The people in this state are very kind indeed. They are doing much more than we ever anticipated they would. I have many more things I could like to write, but have not time. And you may be astonished at my bad writing and incoherent manner, but you will pardon all when you reflect how hard it would be for you to write when your hands were stiffened with hard work and your heart convulsed with intense anxiety. But I hope there is better days to come to us yet. Give my respects to all in that place that you respect, and am ever yours affectionately, signed Emma Smith. End quote. I can't possibly imagine what it must have been like for Joe and Emma, not knowing how each other is doing, only just exchanging these letters back and forth. But luckily they did exchange letters, and Joe wrote back to his wife about 2 weeks later, on March 21st, 1839. I'm not going to read the entire thing because it's kind of long, but I'm going to read a couple of highlights. Quote, I would ask if Judge Cleveland will be kind enough to let you and the children tarry there until I can learn something further concerning my fate. I will reward him, if he will, and see that you do not suffer for anything. I shall have a little money when I come. My dear Emma, I very well know your toils and sympathize with you. If God will spare my life once more to have the privilege of taking care of you, I will ease your care and endeavor to comfort your heart. I want you to take the best care of the family you can, which I believe you will do all you can. If you lack for money or for bread, do let me know it as soon as possible. My nerve trembles from long confinement, but if you feel as I do, you don't care for the imperfections of my writing. For my part, a word of consolation from any source is cordially received by us. Me, I feel like Joseph in Egypt doth. My friends yet live. If they live, do they remember me? Have they regard for me? If so, let me know it in a time of my trouble, dear Emma. Do you think that my being cast into prison by the mob renders me less worthy of your friendship? No, I do not think so. End quote. Now, this is an interesting little detail that I want to point out. It took Joe 2 weeks to write the essentially 3 paragraphs in reply to his wife, after she sent her heartfelt long letter telling how much she worries about Joe, telling about the kids, where she is. And, oddly enough, Emma expressed her affections for Joe and how much she yearns to be with him again and how much it just racks her body with torment to be separated from him. But none of those sentiments are reflected by Joe in his return letter. It took him 2 weeks to write back to his wife. Was he too busy to write back? I mean, he was spending every waking moment lying on beds of matted down straw or sitting at a desk writing, and he just somehow couldn't find the time to reply to that letter. And that's not completely fair because the letter did take a few days to get to him, but the reason I point it out is to shine a spotlight on another letter that Joe wrote during that interim period. And he wrote this on March 15th, 1839. Now, before I tell you about that letter and who it was written to, let's examine that timeline. March 7th, Emma sent him a letter. He got it a few days later. It took him 2 weeks, essentially, to write a letter back. He sent her a letter back on March 21st. However, on March 15th, in that same 2-week window, he wrote a letter to somebody named Presendia Huntington Buell after she made a personal visit to Liberty Jail. This is a couple of excerpts from that letter, and it's how I'm going to read the very beginning of it and a couple of other chunks from later on. But those excerpts, what I'm going to read here kind of illustrates the tone of the overall letter. This is dictated by Joseph Smith. Quote, "Dear sister, my heart rejoiced at the friendship you manifested in requesting to have conversation with us, but the jailer is a very jealous man, for fear someone will leave tools for us to get out with. He is under the eye of the mob continually, and his life is at stake. If he grants us any privilege, he will not let us converse with anyone alone. Oh, what a joy it would be for us to see our friends. It would have gladdened my heart to have the privilege of conversing with you. But the hand of tyranny is upon us. But thanks be to God, it cannot last always, and he that sitteth in heavens will laugh at their calamity and mock when their fear cometh." From later on in the letter, "I think that many of the brethren, if they will be pretty, still can stay in this country until the indignation is over and past, but I think it would be better for Brother Buell," that's Presendia Huntington's husband, "to leave and go with the rest of the brethren, if he keep the faith, and at any rate, for thus speaketh the Spirit concerning him. I want him and you to know that I am your true friend. I was glad to see you. No tongue can tell what inexpressible joy it gives a man to see the face of one who has been a friend, after having been enclosed in the walls of a prison for 5 months. It seems to me that my heart will always be more tender after this than ever it was before. I suppose there will soon be perplexity all over the earth. Do not let our hearts faint when these things come upon us, for they must come, or the world cannot be fulfilled. I know that something will soon take place to stir up this generation to see what they have been doing, and that their fathers have inherited lies, and they have been led captive by the devil to no profit, but they know not what they do." End quote. That was the letter that Joseph Smith wrote to Presendia Huntington Buell. And you guessed it, Presendia would become one of Joe's wives, married to him in December of 1841. Shortly after, he had married her sister, Zina Huntington. Now, read the entire letter for yourself, all right? It's in the show notes. At the time of her death in Utah, Presendia Huntington had the full legal name of Presendia Lathrop Huntington Buell Smith Kimball, having 2 children by Heber C. Kimball. And we're actually starting to get pretty close to those years where Joe was frequently associating with many women who would later become his wives. But just take a step back and consider the timeline of the letters entering and leaving Liberty Jail. Emma wrote that letter to Joe on March 7th. Presendia visited Joe in the jail on March 15th, and immediately after her departure, Joe wrote a letter to her telling her how much he had enjoyed her visit and how it made his heart so glad to see her. And then 6 days later, after he sent that letter to Presendia, he finally replied to the letter his wife sent. And he neglected to detail how much he misses and loves Emma. Now, it almost makes you wonder if Presendia visiting was like a conjugal visit or something. I mean, you make your own assessment of the situation. I'm just looking at the timeline and the content of the letters and making my own judgment. Now, I don't think that they actually had intimate relations in the jail. There were a bunch of men in there. One of them would have known. But given how shitty it was in the jail, it makes sense that being visited by one of his crushes would perk up the mood of the prophet in a jiffy, and then motivate him to write a letter as soon as this hot little 28-year-old crush was done visiting them. Now, I'm not saying hot little 28-year-old completely ignorantly. There is a painting of her, a portrait of her from probably the 1840s or 50s, and Presendia Huntington is beautiful. It's easy to see why Joe may have had a crush on her. But the common line has it that polygamy kind of became a thing 2.5 years after this scenario in Liberty Jail. But think about that. Did Joe court and polygamously marry women that he'd never met before? No, of course not. His wives were all women that he was friends with, or were the daughters of people that he was friends with, like in the case of the Kimballs. I mean, are we to believe that Joe wasn't courting these women long before they were officially sealed to him? Now remember, this whole thing with Presendia visiting them in the jail and the timeline with the letters to her and then to Emma afterwards, that's 2.5 years after Joe was supposedly found by Emma in the barn with Fanny Alger. That happened in 1836. We're in the beginning of 1839 here. There's no way to truly understand what went through that man's mind on any given day in any given situation. But I think putting the timeline and the content of these letters into the broader historical context offers a brief insight to the personality of Joseph Smith. But let's take a step back and think about the whole scenario for a minute, okay? What else did Joe have to be excited about? What else was going on inside the jail that was worth living for? I mean, the conditions were prohibitive to any positivity, much less human life, yet these men were still locked away for months with nothing but visitors and letters from which to derive any pleasure. All the men could do was spend their days fantasizing about life outside the walls of that forsaken goddamn prison, and they latched onto anything that could offer that intangible feeling of connectedness to the outside world. When Joe was writing to Emma, he was reminded of how he was separated from his children and his leadership, and, one of his children was quite sick too, so that probably didn't help. I mean, the letter exchange to and from Emma was just a further reminder of how Joe's bad decisions may have led his friends and family to suffer endlessly, wallowing in destitution. Emma signified Joseph's real-world responsibilities. Now, contrast that with how Presendia's presence must have struck Joe. She was the hotter, younger, more exotically featured, and more ignorantly credulous connection that Joe had to his previous life, long before the responsibilities of cult and family were constantly crushing him. I mean, think about it. Presendia, Fanny Alger, Nancy Miranda Johnson, many of these women who were younger and, didn't have his children like Emma did, they were all people that, Joe probably had crushes on, and they made him feel alive and carefree again at a time when he was looking for an outlet to serve his addictive personality and insatiable hunger for greener pastures. Or shaved pastures. I don't know what Joe liked. But it only takes a tiny bit of foresight, a mere 5 years in the future, to see where his endless appetite for women landed him. But the problems which led to the Carthage shootout are often ignored or simplified. Joe had a lot to wrestle with in having 30-plus wives. Women were essentially the center of his attention for about 4 years, which polarized the public and caused other things which needed Joe's attention to slip away. or to be handled by other people. Presendia visiting Joe in Liberty Jail marks a point in Joe's history where he prioritized one exhilarating aspect of his life over the crushing responsibilities in the rest of his life. This same trend of prioritizing the fun over responsibilities eventually led to Joseph's death. Now, obviously, Presendia was supportive of the prophet and must have shared some level of attraction in order to make the trip to visit him personally without her husband Normal Buell in tow. Maybe she was somebody who had an affinity for people in Joe's position, regardless of the fact that his position had landed him in jail at that moment. Maybe Joe was that dangerous boy. She liked him. By the end of March, Joe was feeling the pinch of isolation, and he wrote 3 epistles that were basically complaining to God about getting shafted constantly since they moved to Missouri. These epistles were later canonized into sections 121, 2, and 3 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Here's a quick snippet from section 121, and it gives you kind of a sense of the overall tone of all 3 of these revelations. Verse 1, quote, "O God, where art thou? Where is the pavilion that covereth thy hiding place? How long shall thy hand be stayed, and thine eye, yea, thy pure eye? Behold from the eternal heavens the wrongs of thy people and of thy servants, and thine ear be penetrated with their cries. Yea, O Lord, how long shall they suffer these wrongs and unlawful oppressions, before thine heart shall be softened toward them, and thy bowels be moved with compassion toward them?" End quote. It goes on like that forever. I'm sparing you a lot, trust me. But finally, just reading that, finally, jail had temporarily at least broken Joe's typically sanguine spirit. His usual attitude of party first, ask questions never had been abandoned in lieu of harsh inquisition of his personal God. Why had God forsaken his prophet? Joe had been the chosen one for so long. Why now was the Lord causing his wrath to fall upon the prophet? Just taking a step back from the timeline for just a second here, and maybe kind of making an overall assessment of what's going on. It's kind of hard to talk about Liberty Jail to believers, because given what happened inside the jail and all of the vast myriad of variables that led to their incarceration, given just how incredibly complicated this whole thing is, it's easy to misconstrue it into all kinds of incredible narratives and evidences for Joe's personal God. So let me pose a hypothetical conversation to you. We have a Socratic skeptic who is asking questions to a credulous believer who is trying to change or alter the Liberty Jail experience to being like a lesson or whatever for God, or evidence for God. So here's my question. So if Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, why was he locked up in Liberty Jail for high treason, arson, larceny, and murder?
Oh, well, that's just religious persecution, of course.
Wait, hang on. So he didn't do anything that may have landed him there for any reason? He was only there because people didn't like Mormons?
Well, yeah, of course. The Missourians just really hated the Mormons. They thought that they were devils.
Okay. So that ignores a ton of historical context, but let's grant what you claim just for the sake of argument. If Joseph Smith were in jail because of persecution, why didn't God just fell the prison walls or set the place on fire without letting the prisoners be burned like in the Book of Mormon?
Well, maybe God was just trying to teach the prophet a lesson.
But he's a prophet of God. Why wouldn't God just tell him what he needs to know? Why wouldn't God just tell him the lesson? Instead of going through all of the troubles and frustrations of getting him locked up in prison for a few months.
Well, Joseph was also a man, and God works his perfect will through imperfect beings.
Oh, okay. So that explains Joseph Smith, but why did God let Sidney Rigdon go, but then kept Joe and Hyrum there and the other guys there for so much longer?
Well, Rigdon, he was sick and he couldn't take the persecution. He wasn't cut out to follow the work, which is why, he fell away from the church after Joseph's martyrdom.
Wait, hang on. So you don't see any naturalistic explanation for anything that happened? Everything that happened, all of the Missouri Mormon War, Liberty Jail, that was all the will of God, and no set of natural circumstances could have landed the prophet in Liberty Jail without God's plan?
What do you mean? Everything in the world is part of God's plan, of course. He knew that Joseph would be locked up, but God can use any circumstance to his benefits. His ways are beyond ours.
All right. This conversation is over because you're obviously historically ignorant and currently stupid. This hypothetical conversation is what happens when you create a no-lose proposition and a non-falsifiable model for history, and try and insert God into the equation. We can't talk as equals. There's always room for God to squeak into an historical equation, but I would make the claim, though, that everything that happens was completely naturalistic. It was all a given set of circumstances that quickly snowballed out of control and rightfully landed Joe in prison. Prison from which he eventually escaped and never paid his debt to society. Anybody, given Joe's circumstances, would have landed in prison. Anybody could have gone through what Joseph went through. He didn't need God in order to be taught these lessons, or in order for any of the Missouri Mormon War to happen, in order for the Liberty Jail to happen, in order for him to write his epistles saying, "Oh God, where art thou? Where is the pavilion that covereth thy hiding place?" It didn't require God for Joseph to land in prison. He just got there through completely naturalistic circumstances. But when you try and have a conversation about Liberty Jail, it's so easy to construe and direct into a way that, well, that bolsters a model for history that includes God. Wrongfully so, in my opinion. But everything in this episode that we've talked about so far it's been focused on Joe and his experience inside the prison. That's what we've been doing. We've been sitting inside this prison with Joe, Hyrum, Alexander McCrae, Caleb Baldwin, Lyman White. We've been sitting in that prison with them, receiving the letters and sending out the letters as we see fit. And that's the only way that those people in the prison knew what was going on outside of the prison walls. But so much was going on outside, and Joe and Hyrum, they didn't know any of it because they only learned what people told them. They only learned about the Mormons' removal from Missouri to Illinois through what people were sending letters and telling them during their various visits. So they were just as ignorant about what's going on as we are if this is the very first episode of the show that you ever listened to. But the last historical episode, that was episode 51, followed the journey of Sidney Rigdon through his stay in Liberty Jail and his subsequent escape after his epic oration delivered pro se in court on January 25th, 1839. Let's pick up outside the walls of Liberty Jail. Let's pick up our timeline there. We'll cover Joe and friends' escape in the next historical episode, along with one or two other written correspondences that came in and out of the prison. But I thought, I really thought we were going to get there today. I seriously did. But the letters that we read earlier, it just got way too out of hand. These show notes got way bigger than I thought they were going to, way faster than I thought. So, here we are. Let's pick up with Rigdon outside of the jail and see what he was doing. In order to understand what Joe and friends did as soon as they escaped the law, we need to cover what happened during February and March of 1839 in Illinois under Rigdon and Bloody Brigham's direction. When the Saints began settling in Missouri in 1838, in large enough numbers to influence elections. This is the beginning of 1838. Politicians and businessmen and all kinds of people began to enter the scene and cater to the needs and the political desires of the Saints in order to secure their business and their votes as a voting bloc. Well, that same phenomenon that happened in Missouri in early 38 emerged upon their arrival to Illinois in 39. It just so happens that the Illinois citizens were largely more receptive to the Mormons than most Missouri citizens had been. But to be fair, Illinois didn't have that earlier scrape with the Mormons from back in 1832 and 33 in Jackson County, which, it really tainted the public perception of the Mormons in Missouri. But the people living in Illinois didn't have any of that to deal with. The Mormons were essentially starting with a clean slate in Quincy, Illinois, and the surrounding about 50-mile radius. The Saints were critically vulnerable as refugees, which opened them up to considering proposals they otherwise may have never previously considered. It had essentially been agreed upon in Liberty Jail that Illinois would be the next settlement location for the Saints. Now it was a matter of making that dream and necessity become a reality, to which Rigdon fervently devoted every waking moment. And here enters Isaac Galland, the man that we briefly mentioned in Party Boy Partridge's letter earlier. That name, Dr. Isaac Galland, now we're going to really cover some details about this guy. So Isaac Galland was a war veteran and a wealthy property owner around the Mississippi in Iowa and Illinois. Galland had a wide and varied career throughout his days, including being a colonel in the Black Hawk War, a multiply failed politician who'd run unsuccessfully for the Senate in 2 different states, a medical doctor, a published author, and most importantly, a land speculator. We're interested in Dr. Isaac Galland for that last career path choice that he made. Galland owned a ton of property. Or, let me rephrase that. Galland held the deeds to a ton of property. So he owned a deed to 1,000 acres in what was known as the Military Tract on the western border of Illinois, right on the Mississippi River. And he apparently owned a deed for 19,000 acres in what was known as the Half-Breed Tract on the other side of the Mississippi in the Iowa Territory. Now, these land tracts were set out by the U.S. government for various purposes. Now, the Military Tract was reserved for government military combatants who were paid in acreage instead of money. The government was doing that to essentially subsidize its wars. They were appropriating land from the natives and then paying their soldiers in the land that they were appropriating from the natives. America, yay! So the Half-Breed Tract, that was reserved for white settlers who were taking Native American wives and having what were known as half-breed children. I know, it's so disgustingly racist, but it was just a thing back then. It was just Tuesday back then. So the thing about land speculation, it was the wild western frontier, okay? If you purchase land from somebody, 6 other people might emerge from the woodwork with deeds showing that the land was theirs and ask why you gave that guy money for their land, okay? Even more than that, people could just write up their own land deed as new areas were carved out by the U.S. government and then just simply claim some segment of that land grab was theirs. And that was it. And that was literally it. The government would carve out these chunks of land and people would just draft up their own deeds and say, this plot of 1,000 acres, that's mine now. That was just happening all over. It was happening in Missouri with the Mormons. It was happening in Illinois and Iowa. Anytime that the natives were removed, this is how their land was purchased, essentially. That's what happens with just a lack of legitimate oversight. It was appalling back then. Well, Isaac Galland had been present for many of these land grabs since the Indian Removal Act had been in full effect. So the roughly 1,000 acres of property that he owned in the military tract of Illinois, that was legitimately his. That was paid to him by the government for his military service. However, the 19,000 acres on the other side, sparing you listeners some arduous details, wasn't actually his. He just had some random deed which claimed that he owned that 19,000 acres. In order to understand Gallen's backstory a little bit better, I'm going to include a link in the show notes to a 24-page, super easy read about Gallen from byustudies.edu, and it's titled Isaac Gallen, Mormon Benefactor. There's kind of a lot to unpack with this guy. He has an interesting story, including practicing polygamy before it was ever cool for the Mormons to be doing it. And I would recommend reading up on this guy to understand a bit more of his role in the land acquisition process during 1839, as well as what happened with him afterwards. Suffice it to say, once Rigdon had settled with the refugee saints in the makeshift Quincy, Illinois, people like Isaac Gallen began to emerge from the woodwork and benefit from the Mormons' suffering. He'd been living in a fairly large 2-story home that was built barely a decade prior, and that was just south of the little swampland known as Commerce, Illinois, but he also owned most of Commerce. He didn't have any neighbors, and the nearest large town was more than a week's ride away. So this proved to be the optimal settlement location for the Saints, and it was only about a 3 to 4 day walk from Quincy, Illinois, where all of the Saints were temporarily camped out. And Quincy was bursting at the seams. They were in desperate need of some new, untamed land to civilize. So after a failed attempt, Rigdon was able to contact Gallen and go and tour the tract of land and discuss possible purchase terms. However, Rigdon, seriously considered purchasing the land that was owned by Gallen, but he wasn't sure it was a good idea. He'd had bad experiences with land speculators in the past. There's also this problem of the ability to pay for any land that Gallen sold to the Mormons. The Mormons were, by and large, quite destitute, as most refugees usually are, given the definition of the term refugee. Even if Gallen were providing the best price of any other land speculator out there, it didn't matter if the Mormons couldn't pay for the land or didn't have the credit to begin settlement on a loan. The solution existed, but the ramifications are questionable. The Mormons still owned a ton of land in Missouri, including the long-held plots in Zion, Independence, Missouri. They still owned property there. They'd been holding on to these parcels of land in Zion since they began purchasing them in 1831. This land in Zion, coupled with the land they'd been purchasing all the years since they declared independence as Zion, tallied up to a hefty grand total of holdings in Missouri, even if some of those deeds were held in dispute for lack of payment. But that's hallowed ground! That's Zion, our holy land, some cried. You can't just sell Zion. That's where the Lord will return at the millennium. Well, those arguments didn't seem to matter when there were literally thousands of people living without homes or food in February and March in Illinois. I'll tell you, this last January I was in Chicago. Never again. That state of Illinois simply isn't for human beings during winter months, much less humans who don't have actual buildings and homes in which to live. So decisions needed to be made in order to save the starving Mormons. And Hingepin Rigdon did his best to make those decisions. Something about Gallen struck Rigdon the wrong way, and he decided to appeal the decision to Joe, who was still in jail. Initially, Rigdon merely leased a small farm with his son-in-law, George Robinson, and the leader of the Danites, Elias Higbee, and that was about 40 miles north of Quincy, about 10 miles south of Commerce. That's the farm that Gallen owned, but he just leased it to Rigdon temporarily. Rigdon didn't trust Gallen, and thought engaging in business with him may lead the church into some form of peril they hadn't yet experienced, imagine that. But regardless of his apprehensions, Rigdon met with Isaac Galland around March 11th and expressed interest in purchasing everything Galland had, which amounted to about 1,000 acres in and around Commerce for $18,000 and an additional, quote, about 20,000 acres, end quote, of the half-breed tract in Iowa, contracted for an additional $50,000 to be paid over 20 years of installments. As soon as Galland saw the Mormons coming, he talked to his friends in the Iowa and Illinois legislative and judicial branches. And this is a quote from the article on byustudies.edu about Isaac Galland, and it introduces a few characters into the mix that will be important to moving forward into the Nauvoo years. Once again, I would recommend reading the entire report about Isaac Galland, Mormon benefactor, on BYU Studies. It really details a lot about this guy. Quote, Dr. Galland, apparently eager to ensure a transaction with the Mormons on the one hand and to satisfy Mormon fears on the other, corresponded with two of his acquaintances, Attorney General Isaac Van Allen and Governor Robert Lucas of Iowa Territory. In the letter to Governor Lucas dated February 25, 1839, Dr. Galland wrote, now quoting Galland's letter, quote, I will come to the issue at once and ask on behalf of these much injured people your permission that they may purchase lands and settle thereon in the territory of Iowa, and there to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own conscience, secure from the robber's grasp, the ruffian's gun, and the midnight assassin's knife. Now back to the article. Governor Lucas responded favorably, assuring Dr. Galland that the territory of Iowa would, quote, extend equal privileges and protection to all. He added that their, quote, religious opinions I consider have nothing to do with our political transactions, end quote. With the contacts that Isaac Galland had with higher-ups in the Iowa and Illinois government, Galland was a powerful ally to have on the Mormon side. And Joe recognized the importance of courting Galland. Now, I'll tell you, I've been looking into this guy for a few days now, trying to figure him out, and, I'm not terribly sure what to make of him. But we'll keep Isaac Galland in our timeline's focus as we progress. Just know he is seen as a polarizing figure in Mormon history, which it kind of seems unfounded to me. Regardless of who Galland really was or what his intentions may have been, Joe trusted him and wrote this to Bishop Edward Partyboy Partridge concerning Galland, dated March 22nd, 1839. Quote, we continue to offer further reflections to Bishop Partridge and to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whom we love with a fervent love and do always bear them in mind in all our prayers to the throne of God. It still seems to bear heavily in our minds that the Church would do well to secure themselves the contract of the land which is proposed to them by Mr. Isaac Galland, and to cultivate the friendly feelings of that gentleman, inasmuch as he shall prove himself to be a man of honor and a friend to humanity. End quote. So Joe was totally on board with Isaac Galland. Now, let's just hope that doesn't come back to burn him at any point. But Galland would eventually join the church, even though the actual ownership of the Iowa deeds that he sold to the church came into question. And that's why, Galland is often seen as an opportunist or even a swindler by some, and he's seen as a good, honest guy who was swindled out of his own land deeds himself, which he unwittingly sold to the church leader by others. He's polarizing. People aren't sure what to make of Isaac Galland. Like I said, it's kind of hard to nail this guy down. But Partyboy Partridge showed the letter from Joe to Rigdon, and Rigdon knew it was time to start serious talks with Galland in order to secure the lands he had for sale. He began those serious talks just as Joe and Hyrum and friends were amidst planning their escape. Rigdon was dedicated to helping the saints and doing everything necessary to secure a safe place for them to live. Remember, a number of those Mormons had been Rigdonites long before Joe ever made his way onto the scene back in 1830. Rigdon was just taking care of his faithful followers, as they were looking towards this white, chin-strap bearded shepherd to answer their turmoil and personal woes. That's something admirable to consider. Once Rigdon got to Illinois, he wasted absolutely zero time in dealing with the refugee crisis on his hands. He was the only member of the leadership not actively in jail at the time, and therefore acted as supreme leader of the church on behalf of the saints. But let's talk on him for another minute here to try and close us out. Rigdon had previously stated that Christ's suffering were a fool to his, claiming that he had suffered more than a Jew who was executed for heresy. I mean, that's absurd. Seeing that Rigdon was still alive after his 2.5 month incarceration, I think he was blowing things a little bit out of proportion. But it remains that Rigdon was in the real world dealing with real world shit, while Joe and friends were locked up in prison, not really able to deal with what was going on in Illinois. Rigdon was a faithful man for decades of his life, never having his faith truly put to trial like this before, and understandably, Rigdon had some conflicting thoughts about his situation. This was reported by John Taylor, third prophet of the church, and it's recorded in the Journal of Discourses, volume 23, page 12. It was delivered November 9th, 1881. That's, like 50-something years. Almost, 45 years after this happened. But he does get to a point, and I think it's important to try and wrestle with this, because I think it does paint us a nuanced picture of what was going on in Rigdon's mind at this time. This is from the Journal of Discourses, spoken by John Taylor. Quote, "We had to leave Missouri, and I suppose God intended to try the saints, to let them pass through certain kinds of experience and place them in a position that they would have to lean on him. Some of the people rebelled against these things in their feelings. Among the rest, I remember being much shocked at the remarks of Sidney Rigdon after he had been imprisoned with the prophet Joseph in Richmond jail, as well as many others. I visited them in jail, and Sidney Rigdon made a remark soon after he got out to the effect that if God did not care anything more about us than he seemed to do, that if he allowed us to be hauled around as we had been, he did not care about serving such a God." End quote. And there's a link for that entire passage. It's on page 12 of volume 23 of the Journal of Discourses. I'll leave a link for it in the show notes. But it further contextualizes what might have been going through Rigdon's mind. Seemingly, he had some challenging personal questions with which he had to wrestle. Okay, he'd spent his entire life serving God as a full-time minister, trying his utmost to understand whatever it is out there that fits into those 3 letters, God. And once again, we end an historical episode on Sidney Rigdon. Let's have that same conversation that we had earlier with a hypothetical believer, but instead let's have it with a hypothetical Rigdon. And maybe we can take into account the fact that he, John Taylor said that Rigdon didn't care about serving such a God who would force him through so much turmoil. Once again, the Socratic skeptical inquirer asking questions of Rigdon. So tell me, if Joseph Smith is a prophet of God, why were you guys interred in Liberty Jail for high treason, arson, larceny, and murder? Well, it's religious persecution, of course. We were suffering as Christ had suffered for the sake of God. So you guys didn't do anything that might have landed you there for any reason? You were only there because the Missourians hated you guys? Well, yeah, the Missourians really hated the Mormons. Well, and also Samson of Vard told of our depredations in Daviess County while he cowardly stood in front of the Mormon hater Judge King. Okay, well, that incorporates a ton of historical context, so let's explore that further. If you guys are indeed God's elect few, why didn't God just fell the prison walls or set that place on fire without letting you guys be burned like what happened in the Book of Mormon? Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. His ways are beyond ours. Maybe he was trying to teach us that which can't be taught to fallible human beings. But hang on. You guys are God's elect people led by Joseph Smith, the one man on earth with a conduit to God. Why didn't God just speak through him and tell you what you needed to learn as he'd done hundreds of times before? We can't question God's plan and will. He does everything his way, not our way. Okay, so why did God let you go, but then kept Joe and Hyrum there for so much longer?
Well, the Lord has blessed me with the power to exhort and move a congregation. He didn't want me to continue on in my sufferings. He thought I suffered enough.
So, hang on. Let me get this straight. So you say God works in mysterious ways. Therefore, he led your congregation to convert to Mormonism, which led to forceful removal from your homes many times and mob violence, all to lead up to 9 months of hell on earth in Missouri, which led to 18 people dying agonizing deaths at the hands of the Missouri militia, only for the Mormons to be removed from Missouri and land in Illinois as refugees. What kind of a God makes a plan like that?
Probably a God that's not worth serving. Possibly even no God.
These are hypothetical conversations, so I can turn them into anything I want. But I'm trying to get at a point, okay? When Joe wrote section 121 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which we read the beginning of, he basically wrote, God, why have you forsaken us? Where are you? Rigdon, on the other hand, knew that only a pernicious or disconnected God would allow his faithful people to suffer through so much turmoil and still continue to turn a blind eye. Rigdon had been contemplating the nature of God his entire life, and he came to the resolute conclusion that whatever God out there which caused all of this shit to happen isn't a God that's worth serving. You have to commend him in that regard. At least he actively contemplates God, instead of just preaching about him. This questioning that Rigdon had, it may have actually served to be a wedge between Joe and Rigdon. Now, Joe was continually content to believe in his God, and just realized that his God had forsaken him while in that dungeon and was probably teaching him a lesson. But once Joe was busted out and was mayor of Nauvoo and head of his own army in a town of 15,000 people a mere 2 years after Liberty Jail, life was all right. God was on Joe's side. But Rigdon continued to struggle with his own personal God for years to come, which likely contributes to the common modern perception Mormons have of Rigdon being a faithless pansy who left Brigham when the church needed him the most. And once again, we end with a segment about how much of an ass Joe was and how awesome Rigdon was. Now, if you read this part in Mormon history from Fawn Brody, No Man Knows My History, you find a starkly different interpretation of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, which only further exhibits the failing historians have in trying to paint a picture of these incredibly complicated individuals. I like Rigdon. He's kind of my hero. You know, I think Fawn Brody may have had a crush on Joe, even though she didn't like how much he slept around with other women under the guise of righteous polygamy. Now, granted, I haven't read the entire book yet, only considerable chunks of it, so my opinion of Brody's work could be completely inaccurate, but it gets to a central point in historical studies. When I was in Utah hanging out with Joey and Andrew of the Pulpit podcast, we got into some interesting discussions about Mormon history and the historical Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon and all of these people. One of those conversations we even recorded for an episode of their podcast. Check the show notes of this episode for a link to the Pulpit podcast. We had a fun conversation there. But we came to a realization that Joey and Andrew see a different Joe and Rigdon and Ollie and Hyrum and Party Boy Partridge and Bloody Brigham than I do. We can each use our sources and personal logic to back up the version of each of those people. We can each explain why we see a specific version of each person, but we can only assert those versions up to the point where we have historical documentation backing us up and logical conclusions. The real Rigdon and the real Joseph Smith were vastly different than any logical construct we try and put them into for the purposes of understanding Mormon history. Fawn Brody isn't right in her interpretation of Joseph Smith. I'm not right in my interpretation of Sidney Rigdon. We may be slightly accurate in some aspects, but by and large, we have our own biases to wrestle with. I've said it before and I'll say it again, okay? Skepticize Mormon history. Construct your own models of these people based on whatever sources you feel are logically defensible. And when somebody poses information which challenges the narrative you've created for some of these people, it's important for your models to be malleable enough to adapt to that new information. That's how we approach history with a scientific mind. Tentative conclusions based on documentable evidence, continuously vulnerable to falsifiable and adaptation. That's how we science history. And that does it for the historical portion of today's episode. Really quick, I want to thank a few new patrons that we have since the last time that we went through this. Looks like we have Jim, Tinkerbell, Levi, my good friend Dan Weiss. Thank you for that, Dan. Thomas, Jan, and John. Jan and John. Thank you to all of you who do support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Hopefully you do consume the podcast over on that app because, you get special Patreon-only episodes. Now, not every episode has extra content to it, like this one does not, but there are some episodes like last week's, where I spent almost an hour talking about something extra that only the patrons get access to. So if you want access to premium content, sign up to be a premium user for as much as or as little as a penny per episode on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And to all of our new patrons, and especially to all of our patrons, thank you so much for your support. That's pretty much going to wrap it up for this episode. I, of course, do want to let everybody know this is related to Patreon as well. We do have our NAMO home evenings on the first Monday of every month, so that's coming up here in another weeks. That's going to be on June 5th. We haven't quite locked down the guest, but if I'm able to lock this person down, I'm really excited about having them on, and it's going to be a really fun conversation. So if you are a supporter on patreon.com, be sure to check your inbox on that day, June 5th, or the first Monday of every month, beginning at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's when we go live with a Google Hangout, and everybody is invited, up to 8 people. And starting with that June 5th NAMO Home Evening, we'll be broadcasting those as just additional episodes for everybody to consume. So that being said, I think that's everything. That's all the business that we need to take care of today. I wanted to really quickly respond. Last week, I asked for some feedback for people saying giving me their thoughts on what they thought about having advertisements, sponsors for the show. By and large, everybody seems to be quite positive about it. And, nobody has said that they couldn't stand or that they would stop listening if there were advertisements incorporated. By and large, people have just said, yeah, I mean, you got to pay the bills too. So sure, do it. And then, of course, I said that if you're a supporter on Patreon, you're not going to, the Patreon edition episodes are not going to have ads in them. You'll get the ad-free edition of every episode. And some of them will be extended episodes, of course, as usual. But, yeah, so over the next little while, I guess we're going to start incorporating in advertisements, and we'll kind of see how that goes from there on. I'll let you guys know. I'm going to be sure to vet any sponsors that do petition to be to sponsor the show. I'm going to make sure that well, for example, I don't think Deseret Book would be a very good sponsor of the show, so I'm just going to make sure that anybody that does choose or does ask to sponsor this, they have a good product, and I don't want to be hawking crap on this show. So that being said, I guess we'll continue moving forward with that. Next week's episode is going to be a conversation episode, I believe. It's kind of up in the air what next episode will be, dependent on many behind the scenes factors. So. Yeah, we'll just go back with that and call it good for tonight. But of course, before shutting this episode down, as usual, I do need to thank my few good friends that really helped me out with this whole endeavor. First off, I want to thank Demonista for posting up on the Facebook page and keeping the conversation live over there. I also need to thank the real Emma Hale for running the Twitter handle and posting up this new memes that have been going about with the church's merit badges. It's like the Book of Mormon evidence merit badge, and it's blank. Been a lot of fun conversation going on the Twitter lately. So thank you to Julie for doing that. I also need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork in the show used with his permission. Please go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog there. Need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music in the show used with his permission as well. Be sure to go to A Lost State of Mind to listen to all of his albums. He has like 9 of them up there now and a couple of singles. Listen to it. He produces some great music. Thank you very much to my friend Andrew Torres of Opening Arguments. Also, once again, I need to thank the patrons who support this and make this a full-time research and historical reporting endeavor. But of course, most of all, I need to thank all of the listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.